Remember when meals didn't need hours of prep or a trip to the drive-thru? Back then, kitchens were full of quick, clever recipes that could be whipped up in 10 minutes or less. They weren't just food, they were little snapshots of family life, survival, and creativity. Some were charming, some strange, but all of them told a story. And the first one on our list is a perfect example of how something so simple could feel surprisingly special. Cream cheese and olive sandwiches. These sandwiches weren't just food, they were a signal. If you walked into a house in the 1940s, 50s, or even the early 70s and saw a tray of cream cheese and olive sandwiches, you instantly knew something was happening. Maybe it was a church luncheon, maybe a neighbor had stopped by for an afternoon chat, or maybe friends were gathering for bridge night. These weren't everyday snacks. They were little celebrations that lived in the pages of homemaking magazines and community cookbooks. The recipe couldn't have been simpler. Soft white bread, a generous spread of cream cheese, and sliced green olives dotted across the top like jewels. That salty, briny bite against the smooth creaminess gave the illusion of sophistication. It was a flavor that felt oddly grown-up at a time when most quick bites leaned toward the sugary or plain. For kids, it was a bold taste, maybe even an acquired one. But for adults, it was a clever way to make a cheap snack feel elegant. Presentation mattered, too. Homemakers would cut the sandwiches into neat triangles, or roll them into pinwheels, and spear them with toothpicks to serve at parties. Sometimes they were garnished with parsley sprigs, chives, or even a dusting of paprika for color. Suddenly, a slice of bread and a handful of olives looked like something far more refined. And the best part? They took less than 10 minutes to prepare. But these little bites weren't only for special occasions. They showed up at casual family moments. A mother making a quick plate after school, or someone enjoying one quietly during an afternoon rest. They were flexible, filling, and quirky enough to stand out in memory. So why did they disappear? Over time, cream cheese and olives lost their sparkle. What was once chic began to feel outdated, and by the 1980s, the idea of an olive sandwich seemed almost laughable. Yet for decades, they were a staple of quick entertaining, and anyone who tasted one never forgot it. Creamy, salty, and just a little eccentric, these sandwiches deserve more credit than history gave them, and maybe even a second chance today. Mock chicken legs. Back in the days of the Great Depression, people had to get creative. Meat was expensive, families were large, and every penny stretched mattered. That's when a curious dish known as mock chicken legs, or more commonly city chicken, started showing up in kitchens across the Midwest and Rust Belt. The name promised chicken, but here's the twist. There wasn't a single bite of poultry in it. Instead, thrifty home cooks would take cubes of pork or veal, skewer them on sticks, and bread them to look like drumsticks. Once fried or baked, the resemblance was close enough that kids at the dinner table could be convinced they were eating chicken. It was a practical illusion, born from the simple fact that chicken, believe it or not, used to cost more than pork or veal in many cities. For working-class families, mock chicken legs weren't just a recipe. They were survival on a stick. The beauty of city chicken was its versatility. Some households pan-fried the skewers until golden brown, then finished them in the oven for tenderness. Others dunked them in gravy, turning the meal into a stick-to-your-ribs feast that stretched just a few ingredients into something hearty. They could be served with mashed potatoes, canned peas, or whatever cheap side were on hand. It was the kind of dinner that filled bellies fast and gave the illusion of luxury when there was none. Over time, city chicken became more than a Depression-era trick. Even after the economy improved, the dish stuck around, becoming a nostalgic staple in Polish and Eastern European communities, in places like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit. By the 1950s, you could even find packages of city chicken pre-assembled at grocery stores, wooden skewers and all, ready for the oven. But as taste modernized and convenience foods took over, this old standby started to fade. Chicken itself became cheap, making the trick unnecessary. Today, city chicken survives mostly in regional cookbooks or the occasional family gathering where tradition still matters. It's a reminder of how resourceful people once were, turning scraps and substitutes into something comforting, filling, and memorable. Proof that a little creativity could make even hard times taste better. Peanut butter and bacon toast. Some food combinations sound strange until you actually try them. Peanut butter and bacon is one of those pairings that shouldn't work, but somehow does. Back in the mid-20th century, when quick protein was a goal and flavor experiments ran wild, this odd little toast made its way into kitchens as both a snack and a light meal. The recipe was laughably simple. Toast a slice of bread, spread on a thick layer of creamy peanut butter, and top it with crisp, salty strips of bacon. That was it. No fancy garnishes, no complicated steps. The result was a contrast that caught people off guard. The peanut butter's nutty richness clung to the roof of your mouth, while the bacon snapped with smoky saltiness. Together, it became something more than the sum of its parts. This was the kind of dish that spoke to practicality. Peanut butter was affordable, packed with protein, and always in the pantry. Bacon, though considered a luxury during lean years, became more accessible in the 1950s as post-war prosperity filled grocery shelves. Put them together, and you had a quick breakfast or lunch that felt indulgent but kept you fueled for the day. Kids loved it because it felt daring, and parents loved it because it required almost no effort. What's fascinating is how this combination has resurfaced over the years. By the 1970s, Elvis Presley himself made a version famous, swapping toast for fried bread and adding bananas to create his signature sandwich. But long before it was linked to rock and roll, it was a humble recipe born out of thrift and curiosity. Today, peanut butter and bacon still raise eyebrows. Some call it bizarre, others call it genius. But one bite explains why it stuck around. It's quick, it's hearty, and it's just strange enough to be unforgettable. Jellied tomato juice cocktail. There was a time when gelatin wasn't just for desserts. In the mid-20th century, homemakers seemed determined to prove that anything, yes, anything, could be suspended in shimmering mold. Enter the jellied tomato juice cocktail, a dish that sounds almost unthinkable today, but once carried an air of sophistication. The idea was simple. Take seasoned tomato juice, mix it with unflavored gelatin, and chill it until firm. The result was a glistening ruby red mold that could be sliced, spooned, or served in cocktail glasses with a sprig of celery. At luncheons or dinner parties, this wasn't considered odd, it was chic. It looked striking on the table, and in the era of post-war entertaining, presentation was everything. Taste-wise, it was essentially chilled tomato juice with firmer texture, but that novelty was part of the appeal. Some recipes suggested adding onion juice, Worcestershire, or lemon for a punchier flavor, making it almost like a Bloody Mary without the vodka. Others pair it with cottage cheese or a dollop of mayonnaise, transforming it into what cookbooks of the time proudly called a salad course. Why did people love it? In part, it was about innovation. Gelatin was seen as modern and versatile, a way to elevate ordinary ingredients into something glamorous. Serving tomato juice as a cocktail might have felt plain, but serving it jellied? That felt like progress, like showing guests you were on the cutting edge of food trends. Of course, to modernize, a tomato-flavored gelatin mold seems more like a dare than a delicacy. But back then, it was daring in a different way. It proved that even the most common pantry staple could be dressed up for company. Today it lives mostly as a curiosity in vintage cookbooks, but it tells the story of a time when homemakers weren't afraid to experiment, even if the results now seem bizarre. Cottage cheese and pineapple rings. If you flip through a women's magazine in the 1950s or 60s, you'd almost always find this glamorous little dish staring back at you. A bright yellow pineapple ring crown with a snowy scoop of cottage cheese. It was colorful, it was neat, and above all, it was considered chic. This was more than food. It was a statement that you cared about health and presentation at the same time. The appeal was simple. Pineapple, once exotic and expensive, had become accessible through canned goods. A perfect golden circle on every plate felt like a taste of the tropics, even if you were sitting in a suburban dining room in Ohio. Cottage cheese, on the other hand, had been touted as a miracle diet food, low in fat, high in protein, and endlessly versatile. Put them together, and suddenly you had a dish that looked fashionable and claimed to be good for you. These pineapple and cottage cheese plates showed up everywhere, on diet menus, at luncheons, even at church suppers. Sometimes they were sprinkled with paprika for color, topped with cherry for flair, or served on a crisp lettuce leaf for extra freshness. For homemakers, it was a perfect no-cook option. ready in minutes, but impressive enough to serve guests. Looking back, the flavor combination was unusual. The sweet tang of pineapple clashed and blended with the mild creaminess of cottage cheese, creating something both refreshing and slightly puzzling. But in that era, novelty and efficiency mattered more than complexity. This dish promised health, elegance, and speed, all in under 5 minutes. Today, the pairing feels like a relic of mid-century dieting, when glamour often meant ration simplicity. But for many, it's still tied to memory. The taste of Sunday lunches, family picnics, or mothers earnestly following the latest health craze. It's proof that even the humblest recipes can carry decades of cultural weight, one pineapple ring at a time. Hot dog roll-up with cheese. Before drive-thrus and microwaves made fast food an everyday thing, families had their own tricks for getting dinner on the table in minutes. One of the most beloved shortcuts was the hot dog roll-up with cheese. It was quick, it was filling, and for kids, it felt like pure magic. The recipe was as simple as it gets. Take a hot dog, lay a slice of American cheese on top, then wrap it all up in a piece of bread or a refrigerated biscuit dough. Pop it in the oven until the bread turned golden and the cheese melted into a gooey blanket. In less than 15 minutes, you had a handheld dinner that felt like a treat. This was the era when convenience foods were booming. Supermarkets proudly displayed processed cheese slices, canned biscuit dough, and prepackaged hot dogs, all designed to make home cooking faster. A roll-up was the perfect way to show off these modern ingredients. For busy parents, it meant supper could be done before the kids even finished setting the table. For children, it was a thrill of biting into something warm, cheesy, and wrapped just for them. Sometimes families dress them up, brushing the bread with butter, sprinkling sesame seeds on top, or serving them with ketchup or mustard for dipping. Other times, they were left plain, no frills, just comfort. Either way, they were portable, fun, and endlessly adaptable. Looking back, hot dog roll-ups were more than just food. They were a preview of America's coming obsession with fast meals. They were a bridge between the old-fashioned kitchen and the convenience culture that was just beginning to take hold. Today, they might be seen as a kid snack, but for a generation growing up in the 1950s and 60s, they felt like the future, hot, cheesy, and ready in no time. Egg curry and cream sauce. In the mid-20th century, American kitchens began flirting with flavors from abroad, but always through a careful, safe lens. One of the more curious results was egg curry and cream sauce, a dish that promised a touch of the exotic, while staying firmly within the comfort zone of the average household. At its core, it was simple. Hard-boiled eggs halved neatly, then nestled into a sauce made of butter, flour, cream, and just a whisper of curry powder. The result wasn't fiery or bold like the curries it imitated, but instead a mild, velvety dish that felt foreign enough to be interesting, yet familiar enough not to scare anyone at the table. Cookbooks often presented it as a clever way to stretch ingredients. Eggs were cheap, plentiful, and filling, making them a perfect substitute for pricier cuts of meat. Wrapped in a cream sauce and flavored with what was then considered an exotic spice blend, they suddenly looked dinner party worthy. Some recipes suggested serving them over rice or toast points, turning humble pantry staples into something that felt, at least at the time, a little sophisticated. This dish reflects a very particular moment in American food history. After World War II, spice blends like curry powder became available in mainstream grocery stores, but few home cooks knew how to use them beyond a pinch here or there. Egg curry and cream sauce was an approachable gateway. It introduced families to the idea of global flavors without straying too far from the safety of cream, butter, and boiled eggs. To modern palates, it may seem timid, even bland, but in its day, it was adventurous. It signaled curiosity, a willingness to experiment, and a desire to bring a piece of the wider world into the kitchen. In its creamy, golden sauce, it carried both caution and excitement. A snapshot of a time when exotic had to be softened with cream before it could be served. Celery logs with cheese spread. If there was ever a snack that captured the playful, processed food spirit of mid-century kitchens, it was celery logs with cheese spread. Bright green stalks filled with orange cheese from a jar or squeezed tube. This was a kind of party plate that felt equal parts health food and novelty. Celery had long been marketed as the ultimate diet vegetable, crisp, watery, and guilt-free. Pair it with a rich, shelf-stable cheese spread like Cheese Whiz or Velveeta, and suddenly it became more than a vegetable. It became a conversation piece. Homemakers loved it because it was quick to prepare, colorful on the platter, and just quirky enough to make guests smile. Children loved it too, mostly because it turned something boring into a snack with personality. The process couldn't have been simpler. A stalk of celery was trimmed, washed, and cut into logs. A knife, or sometimes even a piping bag, would smear or squirt the cheese right into the groove. For special occasions, some cooks sprinkled paprika or bacon bits on top, or added olives, pickles, or even raisins for decoration. The result was a tray of crunchy, salty little bites that screamed mid-century charm. This was also a recipe that thrived on television commercials. Processed cheese spreads were advertised as modern miracles, convenient, spreadable, and endlessly versatile. Pairing them with celery allowed food companies to present their products as both fun and healthy. In reality, it was more about convenience than nutrition, but at the time, convenience was a future everyone was chasing. Today, celery logs with cheese spread feel like a relic of a more innocent age, kitschy, playful, and a little absurd. But they also represent a cultural shift, when food became about ease, color, and novelty as much as taste. One bite was crisp and refreshing, the next salty and gooey, and together they formed a snack that was less about flavor than about the joy of serving something new. Tomato soup with saltines and butter swirl. Few things capture the essence of simple comfort food, like a steaming bowl of tomato soup. But in many homes from the 1940s through the 1970s, it wasn't just about the soup. It was about the ritual that went with it. A can of condensed tomato soup simmered on the stove, then with milk or water, then poured into bowls and crowned with the classics: a handful of saltine crackers and a melting swirl of butter. Saltines gave the dish its satisfying crunch, crumbling into the soup as they soaked up the tangy tomato flavor. The butter swirl softened into a golden ribbon across the red surface, adding a richness that made the canned soup feel homemade. For children, it was often the first real meal they could help prepare, dropping crackers one by one or carefully stirring in that pat of butter until it disappeared. This dish was born out of practicality. Condensed tomato soup was inexpensive, easy to store, and quick to prepare, a perfect pantry staple during the Depression, wartime, and beyond. Saltines were equally cheap and long-lasting, and the addition of butter turned the whole thing into a filling, almost indulgent meal. It was a kind of food that stretched a dollar, but still felt generous. For many families, tomato soup wasn't just a dish. It was an emotional anchor. It was lunch after school on rainy days, a warm-up after sledding in the snow, or a quick supper when times were lean. Even today, the memory of crushing crackers into soup bowls can transport people back to childhood kitchens, where the simplest foods carried the most meaning. Tomato soup with saltines and butter wasn't fancy. It wasn't meant to impress. But it was warm, thrifty, and endlessly comforting. The kind of meal that reminded you that even in hard times, a little creativity could turn a can, a sleeve of crackers, and a spoonful of butter into something that felt like care in a bowl. Bologna cups with peas and cheese. If there was ever a dish that embodied mid-century kitchen creativity, it was Bologna cups with peas and cheese. It was thrifty, playful, and just strange enough to make kids laugh when it landed on the dinner table. All it took was a slice of bologna, a muffin tin, and a little imagination. The process was simple. A round of bologna was pressed into a muffin pan, baked for just a few minutes, and like magic, it curled into the shape of a cup. Into that edible bowl went a spoonful of creamed peas, sometimes topped with shredded cheese, sometimes finished with a dollop of mayo or mustard. The result was a savory little package. Salty meat as the shell, creamy vegetables as the filling, and melted cheese to tie it all together. This was classic Depression and post-war era ingenuity. Bologna was cheap, readily available, and endlessly versatile. Families who couldn't afford steak or roast could still feel like they were serving something special by transforming bologna into an interactive dish. It was scrappy, yes, but also clever. The idea of food that looked fun was almost as important as how it tasted, especially when you were trying to keep kids interested in what was on their plate. Cookbooks and magazines often feature bologna cups as quick suppers, potluck contributions, or after-school snacks. They looked festive without costing much, and they fit neatly into the era's love of whimsical presentation. Even today, you can imagine the surprise of seeing your plain old sandwich meat turned into a little serving vessel. To modern eyes, the dish might look like a relic of processed food culture, something out of place in a world obsessed with artisanal ingredients and clean eating. But in its day, Bologna cups with peas and cheese weren't a joke. They were resourceful, colorful, and undeniably fun. They proved that even the humblest slice of lunch meat could be reinvented into a dish worth remembering. Salmon patties with cornmeal crust. Few recipes capture the thrift and practicality of mid-century kitchens like salmon patties, made from canned salmon, bound together with egg and breadcrumbs, then fried to a golden crisp. They were the definition of turning something humble into something hearty. And with a dusting of cornmeal on the outside, the patties gained a crunch that made them feel even more satisfying. Canned salmon was a pantry lifesaver for decades. It was affordable, easy to store, and didn't require refrigeration. Perfect for families stretching their budgets or feeding a crowd. Open the can, mix in a little onion, an egg, and some crumbs, then shape it into patties. A quick fry in a hot skillet transformed the mixture into a dish that felt far fancier than its origins. The cornmeal coating was a little trick that set them apart. It gave each bite a crisp, golden shell that contrasted beautifully with the soft, savory interior. Served with peas, potatoes, or sometimes just a squirt of ketchup, salmon patties could appear at the center of the dinner table and still feel like a complete meal. They weren't just about thrift, they were about comfort. In many homes, salmon patties became a Friday night tradition, especially in regions where fish on Fridays was a cultural norm. For children, the sizzling sound in the skillet often meant the kitchen would soon smell warm and inviting. For parents, it was a way to provide protein and substance without spending much. Today, they might be overlooked in favor of fresher seafood options, but salmon patties with cornmeal crust still carry the memory of resilience. They remind us of an era when homemakers could take the simplest canned goods and turn them into something nourishing and memorable. A crunchy crust, a soft center, and the knowledge that a little resourcefulness could stretch a meal far beyond its price tag. Spaghetti spoon pie. If you grew up in a household where nothing went to waste, chances are you saw some version of spaghetti spoon pie. This dish wasn't about fine dining. It was about making yesterday's leftovers look brand new. Cold spaghetti, instead of being scraped into the trash, was pressed into a pie plate, mixed with eggs and cheese, and baked until it became something entirely different. A savory pie that could be sliced and served at the table. The magic was in its transformation. Spaghetti noodles, often tangled and soggy the next day, crisped up along the edges when baked, forming a golden crust. The center stayed soft, bound together with eggs, milk, or tomato sauce, sometimes with bits of sausage or vegetables tucked inside. Sprinkled cheese over the top, and suddenly last night's meal became a centerpiece dish that looked intentional, not accidental. This was classic mid-century frugality, stretching food, reducing waste, and finding clever ways to disguise repetition. Families who couldn't afford to cook fresh pasta every night loved that spaghetti spoon pie gave them another meal out of what they already had. Kids thought it was fun, too, because pie was usually sweet. To see pasta served in a slice, steaming and cheesy, felt like a treat. Cookbooks and homemaking magazines sometimes dressed it up as Italian-inspired, though most versions were purely American inventions, heavy on canned sauce and pantry staples. What mattered wasn't authenticity. It was practicality. And in its own way, spaghetti spoon pie delivered both comfort and ingenuity. Today, the idea might sound odd, almost like a hack you'd see in a vintage cookbook. But for families of the past, it was a little victory. Proof that leftovers didn't have to feel like second best. A pie made of spaghetti was warm, filling, and resourceful, a humble celebration of turning scraps into something worth gathering around the table for. Tuna noodle casserole. Few dishes symbolize mid-century comfort cooking like tuna noodle casserole. It was a recipe that turned pantry basics into a family dinner, stretching a single can of tuna into a bubbling dish that could feed a whole table. All it took was egg noodles, cream of mushroom soup, a splash of milk, and a can of tuna to create a creamy, hearty meal that felt both simple and complete. The beauty of tuna noodle casserole was its accessibility. Every ingredient came from a shelf, not a market stall, which meant it could be assembled in minutes with no fresh groceries required. Housewives leaned on it during busy weeks. Church suppers featured it in every line, and children grew up recognizing the smell of it baking in the oven as the definition of home. And then came the toppings. Some families swore by crushed potato chips for a salty crunch. Others used buttered breadcrumbs, and a few even sprinkled cheese across the top for extra richness. No matter how it was dressed, the casserole emerged golden and bubbling, the noodles tender, the sauce thick, and the tuna stretched so thin it almost disappeared. Yet still made its presence known in every bite. It wasn't glamorous. Even in its heyday, tuna noodle casserole wasn't about showing off. It was about survival, creativity, and the magic of canned goods. But that was its charm. It represented a time when families could gather around a humble casserole dish and feel fed, comforted, and cared for. Today, some dismiss it as outdated, a relic of processed food culture. But for anyone who grew up with it, tuna noodle casserole is still the taste of weeknight warmth. It's proof that even the simplest pantry staples, stirred together in one dish, could create a meal with lasting memories. Chicken a la king. There was a time when chicken a la king was the height of quick luxury. A creamy white sauce, chunks of tender chicken, mushrooms, and pimentos, all ladled generously over toast points, puff pastry, or even rice. It was a dish that made an ordinary dinner feel almost glamorous. And the best part? It could be made in minutes with leftovers and canned goods. The story goes that this dish started in hotel dining rooms at the turn of the 20th century, but by the 1950s and 1960s, it had made its way into nearly every home kitchen. Housewives loved it because it seemed fancy, yet required little more than a can of condensed cream soup, some chopped chicken, and whatever vegetables were on hand. A splash of sherry or paprika might be added for flair, but the creamy base was always a star. Chicken a la king also carried the promise of efficiency. If you had leftover roast chicken, this was a perfect disguise, diced up and smothered in sauce. No one minded eating it twice in 1 week. Served in pastry shells or over noodles, it felt like something you might order at a restaurant, even if it was born out canned in a frying pan at home. For children, the creamy sauce made vegetables more approachable. For adults, it was filling, comforting, and surprisingly versatile. Whether for weeknights or Sunday dinners, it gave families a sense that they were enjoying something special without spending much. Today, chicken a la king has largely faded from menus, replaced by faster, trendier meals. But for those who remember it, this dish still represents the golden age of turning leftovers into a statement. It was rich, creamy, and indulgent, yet quick enough to whip up between phone calls and chores, a fast luxury for everyday life. Sloppy Joes. The Sloppy Joe, a true icon of the weeknight dinner. Once a frequent visitor to kitchen tables across the country, this messy, tangy sandwich has all but disappeared from modern dinner rotations. But it wasn't always so. In its prime, Sloppy Joes were a go-to meal for busy families, perfect for those nights when you needed something quick, filling, and sure to satisfy picky eaters. Made with ground beef, onions, and a sweet and tangy tomato sauce, Sloppy Joes were as easy to make as they were to eat. A dash of Worcestershire sauce, some ketchup, a bit of mustard, and a pinch of brown sugar, and you had the makings of a sauce that clung to meat like it was meant to be there. Spoon it generously over a soft hamburger bun, and there you had it. A meal that could feed a family in under 30 minutes. No fuss, no complicated ingredients, just hearty comfort wrapped up in a sandwich. But it wasn't just about convenience. Sloppy Joes were the hallmark of 1950s and 1960s family dinners, served with a side of chips or a crisp salad. Whether it was a weekday dinner after a busy day at school or a weekend lunch at a church potluck, this dish found a place at the table for both its flavor and its simplicity. It had the ability to transform the most mundane of dinners into something memorable, albeit a little messy. Sadly, like so many comfort foods of yesteryear, the Sloppy Joe has fallen out of favor. It's been replaced by more refined meals or swapped for newer fast casual trends. But for those who remember it fondly, a Sloppy Joe still brings back memories of simpler times, when a quick meal could bring the whole family together. No plates, no knives and forks, just a good sandwich and the satisfying mess that came with it. Cabbage soup with vinegar. During the leanest years of the Depression, families learned how to stretch almost nothing into something that could feed everyone at the table. Cabbage soup with vinegar was one of those survival dishes. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't meant to be. It was simple, sharp, and filling, a way to take a humble head of cabbage and turn it into a pot of food that lasted for days. The base was as plain as could be. Cabbage boiled in water, maybe with a potato or carrot tossed in if the family could spare it. Salt and pepper stretched the flavor, but what gave the soup its character was the splash of vinegar added at the end. That tangy bite cut through the blandness, transforming watery broth and wilted cabbage into something with backbone. It wasn't hearty in the way beef stew was, but it warmed bellies and gave the illusion of a proper meal when little else was available. For many families, this soup was served day after day, ladled into chip bowls with slices of stale bread on the side. Children may not have loved it, but they learned to eat it because it was what kept hunger away. Adults valued it for its thrift and the way it could be stretched endlessly. Just add more water, another splash of vinegar, and the pot never really ran out. Looking back, cabbage soup with vinegar tells a story of resilience. It wasn't a dish anyone bragged about, but it was one that carried families through hard times. Today, it might seem austere, even unappealing, compared to modern comfort foods. Yet for those who lived through it, that tangy, humble broth is a reminder how even the simplest ingredients can mean survival, and of how a splash of vinegar can make plain boiled cabbage taste like hope. Corn fritters. There's something about corn fritters that speaks to the heart of summer. They were once a staple in kitchens across the country, particularly in rural areas, where the harvest was abundant, and the heat of the day called for something quick, filling, and just a little bit indulgent. Corn fritters weren't fancy. They were simple: a few eggs, some flour, milk, and, of course, sweet corn. The beauty of the dish came in its ease and comfort. Corn fritters are a perfect example of how food can be transformed with minimal effort. At their core, they were nothing more than corn mixed into a basic batter, fried golden brown in a skillet until crispy on the outside and soft on the inside. The sweetness of the corn paired perfectly with the slight savory crisp of the fried dough. A drizzle of honey or a dash of cinnamon might have made their way in, turning them into a treat that could go from a side dish to a dessert without skipping a beat. But their magic wasn't just in the taste. Corn fritters, like so many simple dishes, were a reflection of resourcefulness. Corn, a cheap and plentiful ingredient, could be dressed up in so many ways. When mixed with basic pantry staples, you had something that could feed a family on a budget without sacrificing flavor. They were the kind of dish that came together quickly, perfect for busy afternoons, a last-minute side to a weeknight meal, or as a snack after a long day of farm work. Today, corn fritters might feel a little retro, but they still have their charm. Whether they're served alongside fried chicken, tucked into a brunch spread, or eaten with a dollop of sour cream, they remind us that sometimes the simplest things, sweet, fried, and golden, are the ones we'll always return to. Deviled ham salad sandwiches. Deviled ham salad sandwiches were the quick fix that always seemed to appear when there wasn't time to fuss in the kitchen. They relied on one little, and that carried a lot of weight: Underwood deviled ham. That small paper-wrapped tin, stamped with its devil logo, was sitting in pantries all across America for most of the 20th century. When you popped it open, you had a salty, seasoned spread that was halfway between a treat and a thrifty trick. Mothers and grandmothers would stir the deviled ham into mayonnaise, or mix it with mustard, chopped pickles, or even celery if they wanted crunch. The result was a creamy, spicy, slightly mysterious paste that was perfect for spreading thick on white sandwich bread. Sometimes it was layered between slices of soft bread and cut into neat squares for lunches. Other times it was spooned onto crackers for a no-frill snack. Either way, it had a bite to it, a sharpness that made it stand out from plain ham or Bologna. What made devil ham salad sandwiches special wasn't just a taste. It was a convenience that can last it forever on the shelf, making it a dependable backup meal when the fridge was empty or payday hadn't arrived yet. It was a store-bought solution that felt homemade once it was dressed up, and it gave a sense of substance without requiring much effort. Of course, not everyone loved it. Some thought the flavor was too strong, too salty, or even a little odd. But for families who grew up with it, The taste was unmistakable. That little can mean a sandwich was never far away, even when times were tight. Today, deviled ham salad sandwiches might feel like a relic of the past, but they remind us of an era when convenience foods weren't just shortcuts, they were lifelines. Baked apples with cinnamon sugar. Baked apples with cinnamon sugar were once the answer to every craving for something sweet when a full pie wasn't possible. They were the kind of dessert that turned one simple fruit into a warm, fragrant treat with hardly any effort. All it took was an apple, a little butter, a sprinkle of cinnamon, and a dusting of sugar. Slide it into the oven, and within minutes, the whole kitchen smelled like comfort. This wasn't just dessert, it was economy. Families could take a basket of apples from the orchard or the corner store and stretch them into something special without rolling dough or fussing with fillings. Each apple was cored, sometimes stuffed with raisins or a few chopped nuts, and placed in a baking dish. As it cooked, the fruit softened, the skin wrinkled, and the sugar caramelized into a glossy syrup that pooled at the bottom of the pan. It was simple alchemy, sweet, tender, and a little indulgent. The beauty of baked apples was their versatility. They could be eaten plain, warm from the oven, or dressed up with a spoonful of cream, a drizzle of honey, or a scoop of ice cream if you wanted to splurge. For children, it felt like a treat that belonged on a holiday table. For adults, it was a reminder that dessert didn't have to be elaborate to feel satisfying. But baked apples slowly disappeared with the arrival of the microwave. Suddenly, desserts were packaged, instant and ready in seconds. Why wait half an hour for fruit to bake when you could rip open a pudding cup or zap a brownie in a mug? Yet, those who remember baked apples know their magic wasn't just in the flavor. It was in the waiting, the anticipation, and the way the house filled with that unmistakable scent of sugar and spice. Cream chip beef on toast. Cream chip beef on toast was a dish with two very different reputations. To some, it was pure comfort, warm, creamy, and hearty. To others, especially those who first met in the military, it was more of a punishment meal, forever branded with the nickname SHD on a shingle. Either way, it earned its place as one of the fastest, most memorable dishes of the 20th century. The foundation was simple. Dried beef, usually sold in thin, salty slices tucked into a glass jar. Cooks would cut the beef into strips or squares, then stir into a white bechamel sauce. Just butter, flour, and milk whisked until smooth. Once the sauce thickened and the beef had softened, it was spooned generously over toasted bread. The result was salty, savory, and rich enough to feel filling without needing much meat at all. In the military, chip beef on toast became legendary because it was cheap, fast, and fed a crowd. Soldiers lined up with trays, often rolling their eyes at the sight of it, but still cleaning their plates. At home, though, the dish softened into something else entirely. It became a quick supper for busy families, or a late-night bite for anyone who wanted something warm without fussing over a full meal. What made it memorable was how adaptable it could be. Some added a dash of black pepper, a sprinkled paprika, or even peas for color. Others swapped the toast for biscuits, potatoes, or rice, stretching the creamy sauce even further. No matter how it was served, it was always fast, salty, and deeply filling. Today, cream chip beef isn't seen much outside of diners or nostalgic cookbooks. But for those who grew up with it, that plate of toast covered in creamy beef sauce brings back memories, whether the mess hall or the family kitchen. Oatmeal cookies with raisins. Oatmeal cookies with raisins were once the kind of treat every kitchen seemed to have ready in a tin or a jar. They weren't fancy, they weren't frosted, and they weren't trying to impress anyone. But they carried the kind of comfort only a homemade cookie can bring. Soft or slightly crisp around the edges, dotted with chewy raisins and warm with cinnamon. They were the everyday cookie that felt wholesome enough to pass as a snack and indulgent enough to satisfy a sweet tooth. Mothers and grandmothers leaned on this recipe because it was simple. Oats were cheap, raisins kept well in the pantry, and the dough could be mixed together in minutes. A batch didn't require special tools, elaborate steps, or even exact precision. Just a bowl, a spoon, and a hot oven. The smell alone, sweet oats toasting, cinnamon blooming, butter melting, made the house feel alive. For children, Oatmeal raisin cookies were often the first treat packed into a lunchbox or handed out after school with a glass of milk. For adults, they were the dessert that seemed almost responsible, with oats lending a hint of healthfulness. You could eat 2 or 3 without the guilt that came with richer sweets. They were everyday cookies, and that was their charm. But as packaged snacks began to take over in the 1980s and 1990s, the homemade oatmeal raisin cookies slowly disappeared. Why measure flour and cream butter when a bag of chips or a wrapped candy bar was faster and always ready? Supermarket cookies tried to imitate the classic, but they lacked the softness, the warmth, the uneven raisins that made each bite different. Today, oatmeal cookies with raisins feel almost old-fashioned, overshadowed by chocolate chip or flashy store-bought options. But when you bite into one warm from the oven, it's clear why they once held their place as a household staple. They were simple, hearty, and always just right. Apple and cheese sandwiches. Apple and cheese sandwiches sound unusual now, almost like something dreamed up on a dare. But for much of the last century, they were a quick bite that felt both hearty and refined. The idea was simple. Crisp slices of apple paired with sharp cheddar, all tucked between slices of bread. Sweet and tart mingle with salty and savory, making a snack that was light, filling, and just odd enough to stand out. These sandwiches were popular because they could be made in minutes and required no cooking at all. A parent might throw one together for a child's lunchbox, or a homemaker might prepare them for a casual tea. The apple brought freshness and crunch, while the cheese added protein and richness. On soft white bread, the pairing leaned toward comfort food. On rye or wheat, it felt almost sophisticated. Sometimes the apple slices were fanned neatly, other times just chopped and piled on, but the balance was always the same: juicy fruit against tangy cheese. It wasn't only about taste, though. This combination had deep roots in American food traditions, especially in the Northeast, where sharp cheddar was often served alongside apple pie. The sandwich was a natural extension of that pairing, making it familiar even if it seemed a little peculiar. For families looking for quick, nourishing food during busy days, it was a solution that never failed. Over time, though, the apple and cheese sandwich faded from popularity. Packaged deli meat, snack cakes, and processed cheese products began to dominate lunch menus. Why bother slicing apples when bologna and mustard were faster? The strange charm of the apple and cheese combination was slowly pushed aside. Today, the idea of biting into one may raise eyebrows, but those who remember them will tell you they had a quiet magic. Crisp, creamy, sweet, and salty all at once, they proved that even the strangest pairings could work beautifully. Macaroni and tomatoes. Macaroni and tomatoes was the kind of recipe that stretched a pantry and filled a table without breaking the budget. Just elbow macaroni boiled soft, tossed with stewed or canned tomatoes, maybe a pat of butter or a sprinkle of salt and pepper to round it out. It was simple, tangy, and endlessly adaptable. Some families added onions or a dash of hot sauce. Others stirred in cheese to thicken it up. But the heart of the dish never changed: pasta and tomatoes, cooked fast and eaten warm. This dish rose to popularity during hard times, Depression years, war years, moments when money and ingredients ran thin. Yet it wasn't just about necessity. Macaroni and tomatoes carried a cozy, homemade feel. It didn't require precise measuring or special skill. A parent could have it ready in 15 minutes, ladling it out in steaming bowls that seemed to multiply servings from almost nothing. The tangy bite of tomato against soft pasta gave it a character all its own, humble but deeply satisfying. Children often remembered it as a weeknight staple, something that appeared again and again on the table, because it was quick and reliable. For many, it became tied to childhood itself. Simple food made with love, even if it wasn't fancy. And for homemakers juggling long days, it was one of those in-a-pinch meals that never failed. But like so many budget-friendly recipes, macaroni and tomatoes slowly slipped away as convenience foods and ready-made pasta sauces took over. Jared spaghetti sauce and box meals promised more flavor with less effort, and the bare-bones version of pasta with plain tomatoes began to feel outdated. Still, for those who grew up with it, macaroni and tomatoes carries a taste of resilience and comfort. It was proof that with just a can, a pot, and a handful of noodles, you could still serve something warm that filled both the stomach and the heart. Rice pudding with nutmeg. Rice pudding with nutmeg was once the crown jewel of thrifty desserts, the kind that could turn a handful of leftovers into something warm, sweet, and comforting. At its heart, it was just cooked rice simmered slowly with milk and sugar, transformed into a creamy, custard-like dish. A dusting of nutmeg across the top gave a fragrance that filled the kitchen, signaling that dessert didn't have to be expensive to feel indulgent. Families leaned on rice pudding during lean years because it stretched ingredients that were already on hand. That half pot of rice from supper could easily be repurposed into tomorrow's treat. Eggs and milk thickened it, sugar sweetened it, and a pinch of spice elevated it beyond its simple roots. Sometimes raisins were stirred in for extra sweetness or cinnamon joined the nutmeg, but the essential character stayed the same. Soft, milky, lightly spiced comfort in a bowl. Children grew up eating it warm after dinner or cold from the icebox the next day, when the flavors had deepened and the texture firmed up. It carried a kind of homespun luxury, cheap ingredients reborn as something special thanks to time and care. In many households, nutmeg was a defining note, that slightly sharp, aromatic edge that made it distinct from other sweet puddings. But rice pudding slowly fell out of favor. Packaged snack cups, instant puddings, and boxed desserts made from powders began to crowd grocery shelves. Why simmer rice and milk for an hour when a pudding mix promised sweetness in 5 minutes? The shift in convenience slowly erased rice pudding from everyday tables. Today, it lingers mostly in diners, church potlucks, or tucked into family cookbooks, waiting to be rediscovered. For those who remember it, the scent of nutmeg on warm rice pudding still feels like a hug from the past. Simple, economical, and quietly elegant in its own way. Cornbread with syrup drizzle. Cornbread with syrup drizzle was a kind of simple fix that turned a side dish into a full meal or dessert without much effort. A square of golden cornbread, hot from the oven or even left over from the night before, could be transformed with nothing more than a generous pour of syrup. Molasses, cane syrup, or even maple, whatever was on hand, soaked into the crumbly bread, softening it and turning it into something sweet, filling, and oddly luxurious. In the South especially, this was the taste of childhood evenings. Cornbread wasn't just a side for beans or greens. It was breakfast, supper, or a quick midnight bite. When topped with syrup, it became a treat that felt indulgent without requiring extra ingredients. Families didn't need frosting, fruit, or cream, just a pantry staple cornbread and the steady pour of syrup across the top. Some even added butter first, letting it melt into the warm bread before the syrup hit, creating a sticky, rich combination that clung to the fork. It was also practical. Cornbread was cheap and filling, made from cornmeal that kept well and baked up fast. Syrup stretched its life, breathing new purpose into leftovers. A pan of cornbread might start at dinner with beans and ham, then reappear the next morning sweetened and drizzled, offering something entirely different without extra cost. But as box cake mixes and store-bought sweets took over, this homespun pairing faded. Cornbread became tied strictly to savory meals, and the idea of syrup as a topping slipped into obscurity. What was once seen as resourceful and satisfying began to feel plain compared to frosted cakes or packaged cookies. Still, for those who remember it, cornbread with syrup drizzle tastes like thrift turned into pleasure. It was proof that a humble slice, with just a little sweetness poured on top, could feel like both comfort and celebration. Sardine and mustard sandwiches. Sardine and mustard sandwiches were once the definition of protein on the cheap. At a time when fresh meat wasn't always available or affordable, a tin of sardines could feed a household in minutes. Packed in oil or water, sometimes smoked, sometimes plain, sardines brought a punch of salty richness that needed little else. Paired with mustard, sharp, tangy, and cheap, it became a sandwich that was fast, filling, and surprisingly bold. These sandwiches often showed up in lunch pails or on kitchen counters when there wasn't much else in the pantry. Sardines were easy to store, and mustard was nearly always on hand. Together, they cut through the monotony of plainer meals, offering flavor that was unapologetically strong. Some people mashed the sardines with a fork, mixing them with mustard until spreadable, then slathered the mixture onto white or rye bread. Others laid the fillets whole, drizzled mustard across the top, and pressed them between slices. Either way, it was messy, fragrant, and impossible to ignore. For working families, it wasn't just a stopgap meal, it was protein that lasted. Sardines delivered healthy fats and substance, while mustard kept things bright and zesty. A few variations even appeared, adding sliced onion for extra bite or topping with lettuce for crunch, but the core of the dish stayed steady. Over time, though, sardine sandwiches became more of a relic. The strong smell turned people away, especially as fresher options became easier to find and refrigeration made deli meats and cheese more accessible. What was once an everyday staple began to feel outdated, even embarrassing to admit enjoying. Yet for those who grew up with it, the taste of sardines and mustard on bread still recalls a no-nonsense kind of thrift. Meals made quickly with confidence and without apology. It wasn't glamorous, but it filled stomachs and left its mark on anyone who tried it. Fried Bologna sandwiches. Fried Bologna sandwiches were the kind of meal that didn't need a recipe, just a hot pan, a slice of bread, and a round of bologna sizzling in the center. It was fast, humble, and oddly comforting. The sort of dish that turned a cheap cold cut into something warm and filling. When that pink slice hit the skillet, it curled up like a little bowl, edges browned, edges crisping, and the kitchen filled with a smell that was both smoky and familiar. For many families, fried bologna was a weekday staple. It was meat you could afford, and by giving it a quick fry, it transformed into something that felt richer than it was. The sandwich usually came together with white bread, a smear of mustard, maybe a slice of cheese if you had it, and a hot, slightly greasy bologna layered right in the middle. Sometimes it was served open-faced with ketchup or mayo, sometimes stacked high with 2 or 3 slices. However it was made, it carried the same promise: fast comfort. Kids especially loved it. Watching the bologna puff and curl in the pan was half the fun, and the flavor, salty, smoky, and crisp, was irresistible. It was also endlessly adaptable. Some added onions to the pan, others slipped in pickles or layered potato chips for crunch. It wasn't fancy, but it never pretended to be. As time went on, bologna lost its spot on the family table. With more choices in the deli aisle and health concerns about processed meats, fried bologna sandwiches faded into nostalgia. Yet for those who grew up with them, the memory lingers. They recall late-night snacks, quick lunches between school and chores, or the smell of a parent at the stove, flipping slices with ease. It was thrift turned into comfort, and comfort turned into tradition. Tomato aspic. Tomato aspic was one of those dishes that made sense in its own time, but leaves people puzzled today. Imagine a bright red gelatin mold, shimmering on the dinner table, flavored not with strawberries or cherries, but with tomato juice, vinegar, and a hint of onion or celery. It wasn't sweet, it was savory, a salad in Jell-O form. To mid-century homemakers, this was a height of sophistication. To us, it's more like a curiosity from a long-lost cookbook. The trick was simple. Plain gelatin was bloomed in a saucepan, stirred together with seasoned tomato juice, then poured into molds to set. Once chilled, it held its shape beautifully, ready to be unmolded with dramatic wobble onto a platter. Garnishes were key. A ring mold filled with aspic might be decorated with hard-boiled eggs, olives, celery curls, or even shrimp arranged in neat patterns. To serve, slices were cut and laid on lettuce leaves, sometimes topped with mayonnaise or cottage cheese. This was the kind of dish you'd see at luncheons, church potlucks, or ladies' club gatherings. It looked impressive, felt modern, and gave a touch of elegance without being expensive. It also carried a sense of healthfulness. Tomatoes, after all, were rich in vitamins, and gelatin was believed to be good for you. Housewives in the 1950s and 60s prided themselves on presenting an aspic that was firm, colorful, and perfectly set. But times changed. As taste shifted and the association with Jell-O became firmly tied to sweet desserts, tomato aspic fell out of favor. To newer generations, the idea of a cold, quivering tomato salad seemed bizarre, even unappetizing. Yet for those who remember it, aspic wasn't strange. It was stylish. It was a dish that showed a hostess cared enough to mold her salad into something special. In its wobbly way, it was once a centerpiece of pride. Graham cracker pie crust with instant pudding. There was a time when making a pie meant rolling dough, cutting butter into flour, and waiting for the crust to bake. But in the 1950s and 60s, the graham cracker pie crust changed all that. Suddenly, a box of crushed crackers mixed with butter and sugar gave home bakers a shortcut that felt modern, clever, and, most importantly, fast. Pair that with the rise of instant pudding, and you had a dessert that could be made in minutes, yet still impress at the dinner table. The process was almost magical in its simplicity. Crush graham crackers into fine crumbs, stir in melted butter, press the mixture into a pie dish, and chill. No kneading, no rolling pins, no waiting for the oven to do its work. The crust held firm, crumbly yet sweet, and perfectly ready for whatever filling came next. That's where instant pudding stepped in. Jell-O and other brands promised a silky, flavorful filling with just a whisk and some cold milk. In less than 10 minutes, what looked like a real pie was ready to slice and serve. This combination quickly became a symbol of convenience and ingenuity. A chocolate pudding pie with a graham cracker crust could turn an ordinary Tuesday night into something special. A banana cream version, topped with whipped cream, was Sunday dinner-worthy without hours in the kitchen. For mothers balancing jobs, children, and households, it was a gift, a homemade dessert without the labor of tradition. Of course, critics at the time rolled their eyes. To them, this wasn't real baking. But to millions of families, it was good enough, and often it was better, because it meant dessert was possible on a weeknight. Today, the combination has slipped into the background, overshadowed by fancier pies and cheesecakes. But there's something charming about the honesty of it. A crust made of crackers, a filling from a packet, and the satisfaction of a sweet ending without the fuss. Canned fruit cocktail salad. If you grew up in the 1950s or 60s, chances are you knew the rattle of a can opener followed by the syrupy pour of fruit cocktail into a glass bowl. This wasn't just dessert, it was decoration. The mix of soft pears, pale peaches, and neon cherries floating in sweet syrup gave every family table a splash of color, no matter the season. It was fast, it was cheap, and for a while, it was everywhere. Fruit cocktail salad wasn't really a salad in the modern sense. It was a base that could be dressed up in dozens of ways. Sometimes it was spoon plain into little sherbet cups, chilled and bright as a jewel. Other times it was folded into whipped cream, gelatin, or even cottage cheese for a fluffier, more filling treat. For church potlucks, it might be tossed with mini marshmallows, coconut, and canned pineapple in what became known as ambrosia. And at school lunches, a scoop of fruit cocktail in a paper cup often passed as the token sweet on the tray. Part of its charm was its accessibility. You didn't need fresh fruit, knives, or even much skill, just a can and a spoon. In an era when convenience ruled, fruit cocktail became a shortcut to hospitality. It could be served to guests, packed in lunchboxes, or brought out on hot afternoons with little more than a sprig of mint to make it feel fancy. But as fresh produce became easier to find year-round, the canned version began to look dated. The syrup felt too heavy, the fruit too mushy. What once seemed glamorous and modern faded into kitsch. Still, for anyone who remembers it, there's a kind of comfort in those pastel-colored cubes and that single bright cherry, an edible time capsule of mid-century life, when a can of fruit could feel like abundance. And there you have it, 30 dishes that once defined quick cooking in America. From humble Bologna cups to jellied tomato cocktails, from hot dog roll-ups to creamy chicken a la king. Every single one of these recipes tells us something about the time they came from. They weren't just meals. They were answers to bigger questions. How to stretch a dollar, how to feed a family fast, how to make something simple feel just a little bit special. Some of them have vanished almost completely, and maybe for good reason. Tomato, aspic, or sardine sandwiches might not be rushing back onto menus anytime soon. But others, corn fritters, baked apples, tuna noodle casserole, still have a place waiting if we're willing to bring them back. Because what's striking is how much heart went into food that was often so simple. A dish could be made from cans, leftovers, or just 2 or 3 ingredients, but it carried the weight of routine, tradition, and memory. Looking back at these recipes is like flipping through an old family album. You may not want to wear the same clothes, but you can't help smiling at the pictures. And maybe that's what these foods are now, time capsules. They remind us of potlucks, church socials, late-night suppers, and the sound of someone rummaging in the pantry, determined to make something out of almost nothing. If you enjoyed this walk through forgotten kitchens, there's more where this came from. This channel dives into food history, strange traditions, and recipes that once defined entire generations. So if you don't want to miss the next batch of stories, hit follow, join in, and let's keep bringing the past back to the table. After all, who knows? The next forgotten recipe might just become your new favorite comfort food.